Machal stands for volunteers from abroad. These volunteers rallied from far and wide to Israel's defense. The men and women of the Jewish state served with distinction in all branches of the fledgling Israel Defense Forces: Air Force, Artillery, Infantry, Medical Corps, Navy, Signals, generally without rank or recognition, and made an invaluable contribution towards winning the war and laying the foundations military training, expertise, and experience were of crucial importance to the successful outcome of the War of Independence. Most of the volunteers returned to their home countries after the war, but a significant number stayed on, and others came back.
A homeland for the Jewish people was a dream 2,000 years in the making.
The Jewish homeland had been a long time in preparation. The Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations in 1922 established that there should be not only a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but once there was a Jewish majority, there should be a Jewish state.
This had been the lifelong dream, center of the Jewish experience, and that's what the Zionist movement had been striving for so long.
South Africa had always been sympathetic to Zionism.
South African Zionism has its roots in Lithuania, which of course is the seedbed of South African Jewry.
The idea of Israel then was something that had a lot of sympathy in South Africa.
South Africa was really a Zionistic community.
By 1905, South Africa had a South African Zionist Federation.
Many of us belong to different Zionist movements here.
The environment, and I'm thinking of the white polity, was very useful for Zionism insofar as Jews had no assimilatory pressures. They could find a position between the Afrikaans speakers, the English speakers. There was no real sense of South Africanism in the first half of the 20th century, and they had a place there which was accepted.
This current of wanting to help the Jewish state, this new fledgling Jewish state, went through like a wildfire.
For us dedicated Zionists, we regarded ourselves already before we came to Israel as future citizens of the Jewish state.
It was a time of momentous change. It was the month in which the State of Israel was officially declared.
The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new State of Israel.
The United Nations took their decision on the 29th of November 1947.
And there we have this amazing current. It was like an electric current that went through the people.
Well, it was fantastic news. We were dancing in Dizengoff Square. The whole place was packed chock-a-block, and we were dancing and singing all through the night.
But from that very day, there was resistance to the notion of a Jewish state.
When we reached the outskirts of Tel Aviv, we passed 3 British armored cars with people standing in them, looking out of the out at the top. And as we passed them, everybody started singing. And one British officer, with his face absolutely contorted with hate, pulled out his pistol and fired at the bus.
The world was very sympathetic to the Jews until they saw that the Jews could fight. And when they saw the Jews can fight, they started being sympathetic to the Arabs.
And the day following the declaration of the state, war broke out on literally every side.
There was Egypt and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and Qaukjes, which was a gang of Arab militants from the Galilee.
You know, you can't count it in numbers. What were we? We weren't even a million. What were we? 600,000, 800,000 again, millions?
The recent persecution of Jews in Europe in World War II was an additional motivator for volunteers to heed Israel's call.
I felt that we got to have our own country. And things like that happened in Germany shouldn't happen again.
6 million Jews were sacrificed.
It amplified for us the need for a homeland.
We were aware of the concentration camps and everything else, because our own family was involved.
My dad has a habit, even because he had a business, a general dealer in Tennessee, and he had a habit, Rosh Hashanah or not, 2 days Rosh Hashanah, he had to go to the post to clear the mail, the post box. So off he goes in the middle of the service, and he comes back with a letter from Europe. Now, most of the people in that congregation were immigrants, all of them. Virtually all of them had family still in Europe. And that letter was the first letter that anyone had received. It created a hell of an impact in the shul. It almost stopped the service. So that's part of the background.
Then there was a deportation by the British of Holocaust survivors, because there was a white paper at the time which allowed 100,000 immigrants to Israel. And the British turned these ships with Holocaust survivors back and sent them to Cyprus and Madagascar and Mauritius, all over the world.
Volunteers came from all over the world: America, Canada, Great Britain, Latin America, France, and Belgium, as well as small contingents from elsewhere. And of course, from South Africa.
Official count, including kibbutz members, who were mostly on frontline kibbutz members, was 832.
Per capita, South Africa, of course, was the top. Even although there were more from America, but we were such a small Jewish community by comparison.
Their reasons for volunteering to fight were varied. Some were ardent Zionists, others were driven by religion. Some felt a simple duty to fight for a Jewish homeland. Some felt compelled to offer their combat expertise. Others were driven by more emotional reasons.
I was very emotionally affected by the story of the exodus of the refugees from the refugee camps, people who had been through the Shoah, who got on these desperate boats to come to Palestine, as it then was, and were turned back by the British.
I've never been a religious bloke and I've never been a Zionist bloke, but I just felt I had to go do my bit for Israel.
We just wanted to get there and do something to help the country.
I felt very relieved to leave South Africa because I was very unhappy with the situation here. And the government had just changed. Remember that May the 14th was when the nationalists came into power.
And then there was a question of Jewish unity. And they realized that the chips were really down.
It was a privilege for me to be taking part in something that we had waited for 2,000 years.
There was also a large contingent of non-Jewish volunteers.
As a non-Jew, what motivated you? And how did your family feel about it? You've been in World War II, you had risked your neck, you survived the war, and here you come to fight in a war which really isn't your problem.
Some went for money, and some went as adventurers.
Well, a lot of them were idealistic, believing that it's time after what they'd heard about the Holocaust
that it was time that the Jews had a place.
I just felt that there was so much more to be said for what was going on than the world understood.
Most of the volunteers had combat experience from the Second World War. Approximately 5% of the South African Jewish population had volunteered in World War II, and that experience was invaluable. For as many South African volunteers that went to Israel in 1948, there are almost as many stories about how they got there. But each person's journey was long, dangerous, and had to be made in secret.
We got here in 4 days. One, I don't remember exactly. The first night was in Dola. The second night was, I think, in Kampala. The third in Khartoum. And the fourth we arrived.
We landed in Ethiopia, stopped along the way in Kenya, Uganda, in Sudan.
We had to act as just tourists. We didn't know we were supposed not to know each other.
And they asked me, what's your religion? So I said, Dutch Reformed Church. I said, what say you? I spoke to them in Afrikaans. And Dutch Reformed. So the Englishman said, can't you see he's too big to be Jewish? So this way I went through as a goy.
We couldn't come directly to Israel. We went to Italy first, and we had to join up with a refugee camp.
And it was in this camp that we saw the remnants of the Jewish population, and we saw the tattoo marks on their arms for the first time, and we heard their stories, and it was terrifying.
Encountering these survivors of the Shoah brought the reality of Jewish persecution into brutal focus, and further entrenched the urgent need for a homeland.
I was hearing it firsthand. I wasn't getting stuff from second or third hand. I heard their actual experiences.
They were still so traumatized in that even if though there was plenty of food, they would still steal food, bread and so on, and go and hide it. As the boat came in, the lights of the Carmel went on, and all these new immigrants from Nazi Europe started to sing Hatikva.
That these Holocaust survivors were sent straight from the concentration camps of Europe into combat is an indication of just how desperate Israel was for help.
One of the chaps who just passed away recently, who used to live here, he took part in the Battle of Jerusalem, straight off an immigrant ship, having suffered the Holocaust.
They sent a contingent of these Holocaust survivors into, and that was a disaster.
They arrived in a land foreign to them, a land already in the firm grip of war.
The first 4 days, I must confess that all our training didn't prepare us for the real thing.
They took us off the boat and I went straight into the army. I went to Kiryat Meah, and that same morning I was put in the army, and that same evening I was sent to the Central Front.
And if you know what it was like then, it was sheer bloody hell.
We changed from boys to men in a matter of 1 or 2 hours.
And I fell into a chat with a British major. Now, we came ostensibly as tourists, so he said, "What the hell are you guys doing here now?" I said, "Oh, we're just passing through on a tour." He said, "You're crazy," and he pointed down at Haifa and he said, "That's where the Arabs have all slaughtered the bloody Jews." He said, "We're leaving, but it won't be 3 months before they beg on their knees for us to come back and save them."
The Machalniks integrated themselves into every division of the army, and their contribution was invaluable.
There were doctors and artillery people and naval people and all along the spectrum of people who had fought in the war, who said, we know how to fight.
The Machal volunteers came from all parts of the world, each with different military training backgrounds. The country for which they were fighting had barely been born, had barely had time to organize itself. The Machalniks fell in with an army in disarray.
The Machal were coming in from all over the world, volunteers, and they didn't know how to cope, which units to put us into.
This thing had come into being overnight, as it were. So where do you form a structure overnight?
The impression of the South African army that I carried forward and in the comparison with the Israeli army was a hell of a difference.
There was no chain of command. Things just appeared and disappeared, and it was like a Wild West comedy.
Because that was the army. It wasn't, drilling and saluting and spick and span uniform.
Well, you had an American would come there and say he was in the Pacific War and he knows about this, that and the other, and so they made him a sergeant, and we found out he knows nothing.
So whoever was doing things, it was wonderful that they did it at all, never mind well or not well.
Everything still pulled together. At time of need, everything pulled together.
Prior to 1948, there was no united Israeli army. Palmach, Irgun, and Lehi were distinct entities with varying political ideologies, each fighting for the same cause, but not consolidated into one unified force.
They hadn't been formed into a complete army yet.
I think when there were three distinct, Irgun, Haganah, and the Stern Group, acting independently, it must have been extremely chaotic.
The Palmach formed the core of the armed forces when Palestine was under British mandate. They were the elite fighters of the Haganah and had close ties with the land.
The Palmach was the cream of the army. They were mainly chaps from the kibbutzes.
We didn't have army bullshit. We had Palmach bullshit.
There was no insignias. There was no officer that threw his weight around. You knew he was the officer. You knew in the jeep. You knew that there was a driver. There was a fella next to him. He was in charge of the jeep, and you knew he told you what to do, and you did it. The moment you got off the jeep, then you were equal.
The Irgun, or Etzel, a right-wing offshoot of the Haganah, was still operating separately from the Palmach when the War of Independence broke out.
It had a unit which had, in the meantime, before we arrived and when they were still separate units, it had conquered Jaffa. It had experience it had been down to Lydda. It had been in actions at the Etzion Block, which was one of the first battles even before the declaration of the state in 1947. They were so experienced that they decided they would stay as an Etzel company.
Things came to a head between these factions with the Altalena incident. When the Altalena, an Irgun ship carrying weapons, arrived from France on the shore of Tel Aviv, a violent clash broke out.
I was happened to be in Tel Aviv at the time on the seafront when it landed, and it was the most dreadful affair.
We as strangers coming here, and we don't understand what the problem was with the Haganah and the Etzel and the Stern gang, and all of a sudden we see and we hear that they're sinking a ship in Tel Aviv which is carrying volunteers and also equipment.
Etzel wanted to keep them, the guns and everything to continue. They had a little army in Jerusalem fighting, and they wanted all those weapons to go to Jerusalem.
And the Etzel came off the front line to go to get the weapons from the Altalena. And when they had come to the shore, the Palmach came in behind them. Ben Gurion said, "This is enough of a good thing. You can't fight wars with different armies."
I couldn't make out why Jews were fighting Jews.
It was a very traumatic feeling for us that we're coming, the Jews are firing on Jews. Jews are sinking their own ship that is coming here.
And we were shouting, boys that came on the boat with me, I said, what are you shooting at me for? I'm on your side. He said, you're shooting. I said, you can't have two armies. Which army are you fighting for?
And the Palmach disarmed all of these people. And they were sent from there into regular army units. And that was the end of the other movements. It just became the Israeli army.
Once this short-lived tension had been cleared and the army consolidated into a properly unified force, there were much bigger problems to deal with. The inexperience of many soldiers, coupled with the dearth of arms, vehicles, and supplies, made fighting a war on all fronts even tougher.
We were not well off with arms. We were not well off with equipment. Training backgrounds varied considerably.
We were idiots. We put 4 bombs up and I got in the cockpit and pressed and the wrong bomb dropped on the ground. That it didn't go off was because we didn't had set it to go off. We didn't know how to do that either.
We had in our own midst guys who just were trigger happy. For no reason at all would pick up their rifles and start shooting, then the shooting would come back. And I mean, I thought to myself, you know, having been in proper action and survived, please, Lord, don't let me get killed in some stupid cowboy stuff like this.
We sort of pinched and scraped everything we can.
They got some basic supplies, and then when we came, we realized that it was hopeless because we hadn't got nearly enough.
Occasionally they'd get the arms, but not the ammunition. Or they'd get the ammunition of the wrong type, which wouldn't fit the arms. That's how desperate it was.
Make do. You know what make do is? Whatever you got your hands on, you fixed up.
The volunteers had a presence in every sphere of the army.
They really participated in all the main activities of the IDF, which of course was the ground forces, the Air Force and the Navy.
With the new army, new units and protocols had to be established.
Moshe Dayan was instructed by Ben Gurion to create the first commander unit in Israel. Dayan was in charge of our platoon, and his 3 main salient points he told us was: 1, as an officer, you lead from the front. 2, when you're going to battle, that the half truck or the jeep that you were driving the back wheels must be in the trenches of your enemy. And importantly, most importantly, to see that you leave no wounded soldiers behind.
As young men with vastly different training backgrounds and combat experiences, anxiety about going into battle affected all people differently.
You're always nervous when you're in the army. Make no mistake about that.
On the second night, lying in one of these dugouts next to my partner, a chap from England, a youngster, he said to me, look, tell me now honestly, were you scared there? And I said, no. He said, I don't believe you. I said, well, the truth is, I was too terrified to be scared.
Everything looked very dark and dim because of air raids. And suddenly I began to realize that I wasn't quite as brave as I thought I was.
But we took chances because we were young. You don't think what's going to happen.
I didn't think of danger or anything. I didn't think that I would die.
You didn't have time to feel that it was hopeless somehow. Nobody was afraid, even though you could hear the guns in the distance. You never felt afraid.
But you get excited, but you're going to a football match. The excitement and the blood running to there, and the game gets hot and everyone starts jumping. That's part of your mentality. You never think you're going to get shot, you're going to get killed.
Their first priority was the procurement of arms and equipment for an army surviving on scant supplies.
We have very few
But embargoes meant that these had to be acquired clandestinely.
There was an arms embargo at that time, and from England and America we couldn't get stuff. But we were very, very friendly with France in '48. And we got in these half-tracks, we brought them in as agricultural implements.
Everything that came into the country was flown in and smuggled into the country.
And they were flown here by volunteers who had not been in Israel before.
The big problem was aircraft. We had to get aircraft and we had to get weapons.
When the bow fighters were flown out of England, that was a great story. They were going to do a film of World War II, and everything was laid on with a cameraman, etc., etc., and they took off and they flew on to Israel.
Stealing a vehicle was part of your obligation.
And if the fellow objected, we pointed a gun at him and we took his jeep. Didn't give him much choice.
Because of its strategic position geographically and its oil wealth, Russia very much wanted a foothold in the Middle East. They used Czechoslovakia, which was under their control at the time, as a front for assisting Israel.
Russia had really agreed to supply assistance to Israel, but they didn't want to be the front for this business, so they allowed the Czechs, which were under really Russian control, to supply us with the aircraft.
The South Africans had been cultured and conditioned in their own way. They were not native to the land in which they were fighting. Everything from military discipline to language to cultural habits was foreign to them. Their integration with the native Israelis was not seamless.
That wasn't easy, because we couldn't speak their language.
No, they said, you've got to go and learn Hebrew. And I said, no, I didn't come to Israel to learn Hebrew. I came here to do a job.
We mixed with them very nicely. But I don't think there was an integration. In fact, I think to the extent that after, in about 1950, they took a decision that by then Israel had probably the best defense force, certainly in the whole of the Middle East, that they would never call. They would accept volunteers happily, but they would never officially send a call for volunteers again.
And yet the magnitude of their contribution was absolutely crucial to Israel's early survival.
The mere presence of foreign volunteers raised the morale of the Israeli troops, that they were not alone.
And the knowledge that they were coming into a country that, to all intents and purposes, looked finished, gave great courage to the Jews in the new state.
I think without the volunteer contribution there would have been no Israel, because the British didn't allow Israel to have an army. Anybody, even with a revolver, could be shot. They didn't have an air force. They didn't know about tanks.
I know that they formed the first radar unit. I know that they managed to get the first Spitfires working.
The brains of the Army and the Air Force and the Navy came from the volunteers because they had the experience. The others didn't have any experience.
They really established the foundations of the IDF.
They contributed very well on the ground force because they were very, they were brave guys.
The real basis of the Air Force and the medical services and radar were South Africans.
Radar was one field in which the native Israelis had absolutely no experience or expertise at all. Israel's first radar unit was built almost exclusively by South Africans.
The unit that we built, we didn't ever expect it to ever work.
when I came, we were given a laboratory at the Weizmann Institute and told to build radar. We had no equipment. And they brought us bombed out pieces of junk that the British had left behind. This middle one became our radar station. You can see the antenna covered in the roof. This became our power supply, converted from an old lawnmower. And this was our workshop.
We virtually handmade everything on that radar set.
I knew a bit about antennas. So Ellie and I, at night, used to go to the mechanical workshop to build the antenna.
And this fellow Ostrov, he had designed what was called a mattress antenna.
But I couldn't find an electric motor for it.
So I'd fashioned some bicycle pedals and a chain.
Ellie was a marvellous craftsman with his hands. He really is highly skilled. And with his skill, we converted this bicycle into an apparatus for rotating the antenna with bicycle pedals.
So whoever operated the radar set sat there.
We trained the girls to turn the antenna like that.
But it worked.
South African volunteers were also essential pillars in the medical corps.
The doctors, there were 51 South African doctors here. Some of them came in the difficult periods when there was virtually no medicines. The surgeons were famous, they saved lives. Nurses, there were 37. There were about 12 combat medics, one of them who was recommended for bravery treating wounded. There were about 20-something other medical trades like X-ray experts, physiotherapists, lab technicians, etc., etc. And these numbers exceeded all the other countries put together.
The medical corps sees a very different side of battle.
I was caught up in the results of war. I didn't fight there, but we fought for life.
One of the most important parts of my work there was training these girls from camps where they still had their numbers on their arms, you know, from their camps. Training them to be theatrists, nurses and nurses.
The staff would attend to whatever had to be done. The difference in rank was non-existent.
But perhaps the most profound of the South African volunteers' contributions was in the skies. They played an essential role, not just in sourcing aircraft, but also in flying them. Without South African volunteers, there would have been no Air Force. With no Air Force, it's likely Israel would have lost the war.
There were 425 Machal aircrew, mainly from the Anglo-Saxon countries. The largest number came from the United States. I think it was about 180. The next biggest contingent was South Africa. We had 80 guys in the Air Force. 92 non-Jews were amongst the 425. They were 21% of the air crews.
The Machal could not have left it to the few Israelis who were pilots or otherwise, because the Palestinians, the Palestinian Israelis, were only allowed to be sergeants in the Royal Air Force.
I mean, there were quite a lot of the volunteers that came to Israel, and Machal and also paid, had experience during the war. I mean, where else would Israel get all of a sudden get pilots from?
The South African guys did a very, very important job then. They weren't up against the great Air Force. The Arabs were not great pilots at all.
They were so surprised to find out that we had aircraft, an Air Force. They had to just stop them in the tracks. They never got close to Tel Aviv again.
They wanted Air Force particularly because there was no foundation. The Haganah had people that have fought before, but the Air Force would be starting from scratch.
These were Israelis So typical. They'd been in the, what is called Hugatufa, the flying club, the junior flying club, and they knew everything about flying except flying.
Some aircraft were put together from junk heaps left by the British. The guys flew anything and everything.
Well, yes, sir, you know what flying is all about. Flying, you're very much on your own. You're up in the skies there, and I don't know if it's heroism, but you have a feeling of superiority vis-a-vis all the other ground forces. You are up top, and I wouldn't call it heroic, but I would say that it's a much more significant individual contribution.
The Air Force was controlled by South Africans.
Before we had our codes and ciphers in the Air Force, we used Afrikaans.
Without the Air Force, mostly in the hands of foreign volunteers, we would never have survived the War of Independence.
There were many South Africans who acquired legendary status in the nascent Israeli Air Force.
We were born with wonderful godfathers. Well, I remember one night when we had a get-together with Machal, and Asa Weizmann, who's not a modest man, wasn't a modest man at all. He said, everything that I learned about aerial warfare, I learned from Sid Cohen.
When Sid Cohen went back to South Africa, the Air Force sent up 4 Spitfires to accompany the aircraft as it left the state of Israel. That's what the Air Force thought of Sid Cohen.
A pivotal moment in the War of Independence was Operation Hiram, another vital mission in which South African volunteers played a substantial role. The objective was to capture the strategically important Upper Galilee from the Arab Liberation Army. Although the battle lasted a mere 2.5 days, it established Israel's northern borders.
It was the night of the 28th of October. We moved and stumbled through this place all night.
In a weekend, we cleared the whole of the Galilee.
3-4 days, we just walked right through them. There was very few casualties, took lots of prisoners, and we opened up the road there.
While we were exchanging fire, they went in and cleared room by room. You know the old system, throwing a hand grenade in, running in and shooting. And when they cleared the room, we moved around and we all met on the other side and we cleared the village house by house.
And that actually set the boundaries for the north.
It was really one of the wonders of the whole war.
Israel's borders have long been in dispute. Operation Hiram secured the Upper Galilee for Israel, an area originally slated to be part of the Arab state by the UN partition plan.
And we left Israel really in an unsatisfactory condition. Those armistice lines were very, very unsatisfactory.
Israel has no borders. Where is Israel? Where does it begin? Where does it end?
Egyptians were in control of the whole of the Sinai. The Jordanians were in control of East Jerusalem and the West Bank. The Syrians were in control of the Golan Heights. And it was left to the following wars to put all that right.
Many of the Machal volunteers made the highest sacrifice for Israel's survival.
Israel in that war had a population, the whole of Israel, of 650,000.
6,300 Israelis were killed in that war, civilians and military personnel.
Take the percentage, no war in any war has ever had that high.
7 of the South African Machalniks lost their lives during the war. Opinions are divided over whether their contribution and the contribution of the collective efforts of all the volunteers has been overlooked.
Yes, I think it has been underplayed.
I don't think it's been underplayed deliberately. I think it has just not been appreciated in the context of what it was at the time?
I don't know that it needs to be appreciated. We did what we wanted to do.
I don't know. They might have been able to do without me just as well.
I would go so far as to say that if you asked a member of the General Staff today about Machal, he doesn't know anything about it.
This country is so full of problems. Milo, you forget what actually people did.
Over 90 to 95% of the population don't even know what happened in 1948.
But the great leaders knew that this was something they couldn't have done without.
The ex-Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, he made a speech and he said, "You came when we needed you most, and you helped us."
Given the extent to which Israel was outnumbered and outarmed, expectations of survival were low.
The odds were against us.
Why they didn't walk all over us in the first couple of days, I to this day don't understand.
As far as America, Britain and the Arabs were concerned, within 10 to 14 days, the war should have been over.
How did a population of just over 500,000 people fend off better equipped armies attacking from all sides? What was the key to Israel's victory in that war?
People don't realize why the Israelis won the war.
The feelings amongst the people was very strong. Without that, could not have survived.
The fact that after millions of us had been murdered, at last the Jews had arms in their hands and were able to defend themselves. That did something to every conscious Jew in that area.
I think the general feeling was that nobody had any doubts. They had to fight and they knew they were doing it. We were in the thick of things. It didn't even occur to me specifically that we wouldn't win this war. There's that atmosphere of we have to do it. That's an Israeli feeling.
I said that my main person that I would choose to have made the victory possible would be Ben-Gurion, who organized and whiplashed people into his way of thinking to carry on and to be desperate and to know that we either win or we die.
There was a radiance from him. There was a force that emanated from him which was palpable.
Ben-Gurion's predecessor, if you like, Churchill, said, the people will survive. The people's mood, the people's determination. The fact that they too have no alternative.
Ein Brera. You know what that means? No option.
Ein Brera. There's no option.
No alternative.
No alternative.
No alternative.
No alternative.
At ground level, at floor level, the Egyptians and the Jordanians hated each other's guts.
Whenever we fought against the Jordanians, the Egyptians stood one way. And they were just pleased that we were hammering the Jordanians. And when we were fighting against the Egyptians, the Jordanians just stood aside and we could just carry on and fight them. If they would have all attacked us at the same time, it would have been a different story.
The amount of heroism individually of people is unbelievable.
They nearly all went back to their countries of origin.
Because it was very unsettling. And unless you had family and some background, it was very hard to find an entry point.
I gave it 30 seconds thought. I went to a kibbutz, and when I saw they were having to milk the cows at 5 in the morning, I grabbed my bag and I ran for my life.
The thinking and philosophy of the Jew who came from the diaspora was not the same as the indigenous person.
Israel has changed drastically over the decades, politically, socially, militarily, and technologically. These men and women were there at the literal birth of the nation and have lived through every stage of the country's evolution.
It's quite different today than what it was in 48. You know, there we were fighting for survival and everybody was just together.
That's the most difficult of all. In 1948, there were 650,000 wonderful souls in Israel.
We've advanced tremendously, technically, but the spirit of the people is not what it used to be.
Isn't that tie, that close tie to the land and to the country that existed when the British ran the country and there were Jews and Arabs. The Jews wanted what they've got, but that feeling is dissipated.
On the whole, our children take a lot of their past for granted because they're different, they're sabras, they've never felt the diaspora, and they don't know what it means to have anti-Semitism.
I'm very proud of Israel today. Tremendous strides in every sphere, agriculture, high tech. It's a modern, thriving community.
It started to improve dramatically in a technological way and in a cultural way.
And when I look at the miracle that is Israel, people say it's a miracle. It's beyond that. It was like a second creation.
Well, 1948 paved the way for it, for sure. For sure.